Rent's up 75%. Time you learned what the real world costs, my father announced, carving the turkey with the precision of a surgeon removing hope from my chest. My name is Marcus, and what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the price of being taken for granted. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The gravy boat sat between us like a moat, separating the family eye-to-eye. Sacrificed everything from the sun they'd never bothered to truly see. Steam rose from the mashed potatoes while my blood pressure spiked, watching my younger brother Dylan lean back in his chair, smirking like he'd just witnessed the funniest show on earth. I'd walked into that dining room exhausted from another 18-hour day, my back aching from loading delivery trucks, my hands still stained with hydraulic fluid from fixing the warehouse equipment they'd been too cheap to replace. 3.5 years of this. 3.5 years of being the invisible engine keeping the Hartwell family trucking business alive, while everyone else coasted on the momentum I generated. The cranberry sauce gleamed under the chandelier. They'd bought last month, the same week they'd told me the company couldn't afford to give me health insurance. "Business is tight," Dad had said then, adjusting his new Rolex. "We all have to make sacrifices." But tonight, watching Dylan scroll through his phone while Mom fussed over the presentation of a meal I'd helped pay for, I realized something fundamental had shifted. The sacrifices had only ever flowed in one direction. "You're 28, Marcus," Dad continued, his voice carrying that tone he used when explaining basic concepts to drivers who'd missed their delivery windows. "Most men your age are supporting families, not living in their childhood bedroom." I set down my fork carefully, measuring my words. "I've been supporting this family for years, Dad. I've been supporting the business that keeps this house running." Mom looked up from arranging dinner rolls, her expression somewhere between uncomfortable and dismissive. "Oh, sweetheart, we all contribute in our own ways." Dylan snorted, not even looking up from his screen. "Right, like when you contributed by dropping out of college to play hero." The memory hit like a punch to the sternum. 4 years ago, when Dad's heart attack had nearly killed him and the business was hemorrhaging money, I'd been 2 semesters away from finishing my engineering degree at State. While Dylan was pledging his fraternity and Mom was having nervous breakdowns in hospital waiting rooms, I'd quietly withdrawn from school, moved back home, and stepped into the chaos of Hartwell logistics. "Someone had to," I said quietly, but Dylan was already launching into his favorite story about how I'd always been dramatic, always trying to be the martyr. I turned him out, watching Dad's face instead. No recognition, no acknowledgement, just the same expectant stare he'd give any employee who wasn't moving fast enough for his liking. The man I'd watched code blue in the ICU, whose business I'd pulled back from bankruptcy, whose reputation I'd rebuilt one satisfied customer at a time, was looking at me like I owed him something. The irony was suffocating. I'd transformed their failing trucking company into a legitimate logistics operation. When I started, they had 6 trucks, 3 reliable drivers, and more debt than assets. Now we had a fleet of 22 vehicles, contracts with major retailers, and a reputation for reliability that stretched across 3 states. But none of that mattered at this table. Here, I was still just the kid who'd chosen duty over dreams, still the one who was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of propping up everyone else's comfort. "The rent increase is fair," Dad said, returning to his turkey like the conversation was over. "Market rate for a room in this area is $800 a month. We've been charging you $4. Time to grow up." $800. More than half my take-home pay from the salary they'd grudgingly started paying me last year. The same salary Dylan had laughed about when he'd heard, calling it charity money for charity work. I looked around the table at the faces of people who shared my DNA, but seemed to inhabit a completely different reality. Mom, who'd spent the afternoon coordinating with the catering company for Dylan's upcoming graduation party. Dylan, who'd managed to stretch a 4-year degree into 6 years while accumulating enough debt to buy a house, all of it mysteriously handled by family resources. Dad, who'd somehow forgotten that the business thriving enough to afford rent increases was the direct result of my 80-hour weeks. "I need to think about it," I said, standing up from the table. "Think about what?" Dad's voice sharpened. "It's not a negotiation, son. It's a fact. January 1st, $800 a month, or you find somewhere else to live." I nodded slowly, feeling something cold and clarifying settle in my chest. "You're right. It's not a negotiation." Walking to my room, I could hear Dylan's voice carrying. Down the hallway, already spinning the story into comedy. "Did you see his face? Like we just told him Santa wasn't real." But they were wrong about one thing. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even surprised. For months I'd been watching the signs, cataloging the casual dismissals, the credit taken for my work, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. What I felt now was something sharper and more useful than hurt. I felt clarity. In my room, surrounded by the engineering textbooks I'd never gotten to finish and the business plans I'd drafted for expansions they'd never bothered to read, I opened my laptop. Not to sulk or to job hunt, but to access something I'd been building in secret for 8 months. While they'd been planning Dylan's graduation party and calculating how much more money they could squeeze from their most productive employee, I'd been developing what would become their biggest nightmare, a direct competitor built on everything they'd taught me, everything they'd shown me, and everything they'd never bothered to protect. The folder on my desktop was labeled Phoenix Freight, Solutions, and inside were the blueprints for their destruction, client lists I'd memorized, vendor relationships I'd cultivated, operational improvements I'd never implemented because we've always done it this way. Most importantly, I had something they'd never thought to secure: the trust of drivers, dispatchers, and customers who'd learned to associate quality service with my face, not the Hartwell name. Thanksgiving had just become a deadline. January 1st wasn't just when my rent would increase to $800. It was when Marcus Hartwell would stop existing as their unpaid savior and start existing as their most dangerous competitor. The turkey was probably getting cold downstairs, but I wasn't hungry anymore. I was finally, after 3.5 years of being starved for recognition, ready to feast on something much more satisfying than gratitude. I was ready to watch them learn the difference between having an employee and having a son, between taking credit and taking responsibility, between running a family business and running a business that happened to employ a family. They wanted me to grow up? Perfect. Growing up meant understanding that loyalty was a contract, not a gift. And they'd just breached theirs in the most expensive way possible. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Dylan's music bleeding through the walls and the smell of coffee I hadn't made. Friday after Thanksgiving, and the house buzzed with the comfortable chaos of a family that had already forgotten last night's tension. Mom was on the phone with her sister, laughing about some neighbor's drama. Dad was in his office, probably reviewing the weekend delivery schedules I'd organized. Before dinner yesterday, business as usual, except nothing was usual anymore. I dressed quietly and slipped out to the warehouse before anyone could corner me with forced small talk or passive-aggressive comments about thinking it over. The Hartwell Logistics building sat on 12 acres of industrial land that Dad had inherited from his father, a fact he mentioned whenever anyone questioned his business acumen. What he didn't mention was how close we'd come to losing it all. The morning air was crisp, carrying the diesel smell and road dust that had become as familiar as breathing. I unlocked the main office, disarmed the security system, and settled into the cramped space that served as my unofficial headquarters. 3 mismatched desks, a filing cabinet that hadn't been organized since the Clinton administration, and a coffee maker that produced liquid barely qualified as coffee. This was where I'd spent the last 3.5 years rebuilding their dream. Where I'd negotiated contracts, managed payroll, handled customer complaints, and somehow transformed a failing trucking company into something worth envying. Every successful quarter, every satisfied client, every driver who stayed instead of jumping to a competitor, it all traced back to decisions made in this ugly little room. But as I powered up my laptop and pulled up the Phoenix Freight Solutions files, I realized I'd been thinking about it all wrong. I hadn't been rebuilding their dream. I'd been building my own foundation, one lesson at a time, one relationship at a time, one small victory at a time. The first thing I'd learned was that trucking wasn't really about trucks. It was about trust. Clients didn't care about your fleet, size, or your fancy equipment if their cargo didn't arrive on time, intact, and with proper documentation. Dad's old-school approach had been to promise everything and hope for the best. My approach had been to promise only what we could deliver, then deliver more than we promised. The second thing I'd learned was that drivers weren't just employees, they were partners. Dad treated them like interchangeable parts, replaceable whenever they asked for better routes or more reasonable deadlines. I'd learned their names, their families' names, their preferred routes, their strengths and limitations. When Sarah Martinez had asked for more local runs because her daughter was starting high school, I'd restructured 3 routes to accommodate her. When Big Jim Patterson had wanted to transition from long-haul to day runs as he got older, I'd created a new position that utilized his experience training newer drivers. The result was a driver retention rate that made our competitors jealous and clients confident. While other companies dealt with constant turnover and the delays that came with inexperienced drivers, we maintained consistency. Consistency led to reliability. Reliability led to trust. And trust led to the kind of word-of-mouth marketing that no advertising budget could buy. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I pulled up my contact list and started scrolling through names that represented 3 years of relationship building. Tommy Chen at Riverside Manufacturing, who'd started giving us overflow work after we'd salvaged a disaster shipment that another company had abandoned. Jennifer Walsh at Mountain View Distribution, who'd switched all her East Coast routes to us after I'd personally driven to her facility at midnight to handle an emergency pickup. Dave Rodriguez at Apex Retail, who'd told me last month that he'd never worked with a more professional operation. These weren't just business contacts. They were people who trusted Marcus Hartwell to solve their problems, not because of the company name on the trucks, but because of the person who answered the phone when they called. I opened a new document and started typing. Dear valued partner, I began, then stopped. Too formal, too corporate. These were people who'd worked with me personally, who'd called my cell phone at all hours, who'd trusted me with their emergencies. Hi, Jennifer. I started over. I wanted to let you know about some changes coming to my situation that might affect our working relationship. For the next 2 hours, I crafted individualized messages to every major client, every vendor, every partner relationship I'd built. Not from letters, but personal communications that acknowledged our history and offered a path forward. I wasn't burning bridges. I was inviting people to cross them with me. The hardest part was explaining without sounding bitter. These people had worked with Hartwell Logistics, but they'd trusted Marcus Hartwell. Now, I had to help them understand that those weren't the same thing. By noon, I had 47 messages drafted but not sent. Each one represented months or years of relationship building, trust earned through consistent performance, and professional respect that transcended company loyalty. Each one was also a loaded weapon pointed at the heart of my family's business. I saved the files and closed the laptop. The warehouse was filling up with the Friday afternoon crew, drivers dropping off, equipment, mechanics working on weekend maintenance. Through the window, I could see Carlos Mendez checking fluid levels on Truck 17, the same methodical approach he brought to every task. Maria Santos was reviewing her delivery logs with the attention to detail that had made her our most requested driver for fragile cargo. These people had become more than coworkers. They'd become the team that made everything possible. And they'd followed my leadership, not my father's authority. I walked out into the main warehouse area, where the familiar sounds of diesel engines and hydraulic lifts created a symphony of productivity. This was where I'd learned that leadership wasn't about having the right title or the loudest voice. It was about showing up, solving problems, and treating people like human beings instead of resources. "Marcus," Maria called out from her truck, "can you look at this delivery report? The customer's saying we missed something, but my documentation shows everything was delivered." I walked over and spent 15 minutes reviewing her paperwork, cross-referencing it with the customer's complaint and identifying the discrepancy, a simple data entry error on their end, but it would have taken Maria hours to prove it on her own. Instead, she could focus on driving while I handled the administrative detective work. This was what I did dozens of times every day. Small problems that could become big problems if ignored. Relationships that needed maintenance, systems that required constant adjustment. I was the oil that kept their machine running smoothly, the translator between their old-world approach and the modern logistics industry. And tomorrow, I was going to stop. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself memorizing details I'd never noticed before. The way afternoon sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The sound of air brakes and backup alarms that had become the soundtrack to my adult life. The smell of motor oil and coffee and the industrial soap we used to clean everything. This warehouse had been my business school, my laboratory, my proving ground. Every skill I'd developed, every relationship I'd built, every system I'd created, it had all happened here. But it had never really been mine. By 5 o'clock, the day shift was finishing up and the evening crew was taking over. I locked up the office and walked back to my car, my laptop bag heavy with plans that would reshape everything. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to the overnight security crew and the dispatchers who managed our West Coast operations. I sat in my car for a moment, looking back at the building that had consumed my 20s. Tomorrow was Saturday, and I had work to do. Not for Hartwell Logistics, but for Phoenix Freight Solutions. Not for the family that had taken my sacrifice for granted, but for the future I was about to build. The rent increase had been meant as a wake-up call. Dad wanted me to understand my place in the hierarchy, to accept that I was an employee first and a son second. But he'd miscalculated. I wasn't just an employee they could push around. I was the architect of their success, and I was about to show them what happened when the architect decided to build something new. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made every breath visible and every step deliberate. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., not from insomnia, but from anticipation. Today was the day I'd stop planning and start executing. My first stop was a 24-hour diner called Mel's, 15 minutes from the house, where I'd arranged to meet someone who could change everything. Detective Ray Kowalski wasn't a detective anymore. He'd retired from the state police 2 years ago and started a small private investigation firm. More importantly, he was Sarah Martinez's brother-in-law, and he owed me a favor. 6 months ago, when Sarah's teenage son had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd and disappeared for 3 days, I'd helped coordinate an unofficial search that involved half our driver network. We'd found him before anything terrible happened, and Ray had never forgotten that I'd mobilized 20 professional drivers to canvass 3 counties without asking for overtime or compensation. "You look like hell, Marcus," Ray said as he slid into the booth across from me. He was a compact man with steel gray hair and the kind of steady eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "I feel like I'm about to commit professional suicide," I replied, pushing a coffee cup toward him. "But I need to know exactly what I'm working with before I pull the trigger." I'd called Ray yesterday afternoon with a simple request. I needed a comprehensive background check on my own family's business. Not because I suspected criminal activity, but because I suspected incompetence, financial irregularities, and the kind of sloppy record-keeping that could sink a company if exposed at the wrong moment. Ray pulled out a manila folder thick enough to use as a doorstop. You weren't kidding when you said you wanted everything. Tax records, insurance claims, vendor contracts, employee files, state compliance reports, DOT inspection records. I even pulled the environmental impact assessments for your property. He opened the folder and spread documents across the table, like a poker dealer revealing a royal flush. Marcus, I've got to ask, are you planning to sue them or destroy them? Neither, I said, scanning the first page of what appeared to be a detailed analysis of our insurance claims history. I'm planning to leave them, but I need to understand exactly what I'm leaving behind. What Ray had uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. The insurance claims alone painted a picture of systemic negligence that made my stomach turn. In the past 18 months, we'd filed claims for 6 accidents that could have been prevented with proper maintenance, 4 cargo damage incidents that resulted from overloading trucks beyond their rated capacity, and 2 workers' compensation claims from drivers who'd been injured while working mandatory overtime. Your father's been cutting corners everywhere, Ray said, pointing to a series of highlighted sections. Look at these maintenance records. Half your fleet is overdue for major services. The state DOT has issued 3 warnings about compliance violations in the past year alone. I stared at the numbers, remembering every time I'd suggested upgrading equipment or hiring additional maintenance staff, only to be told that we'll make do with what we have. What I hadn't realized was that Dad had been gambling with our commercial licenses, our insurance rates, and our drivers' safety to maintain profit margins. There's more, Ray continued, flipping to another section. Your company's been audited twice by the IRS in the past 5 years. Both times, they found discrepancies in expense reporting and employee classification. Nothing criminal, but enough to trigger ongoing scrutiny. The employee classification issue hit me like a punch to the gut. For the first 2 years I'd worked for the company, Dad had classified me as an independent contractor rather than an employee. It had saved him money on payroll taxes and benefits, but it had also meant I'd been responsible for my own Social Security contributions and hadn't been eligible for unemployment insurance or workers' compensation. Ray, what would happen if someone filed complaints about these violations with the appropriate state agencies? He leaned back in his booth, studying my face. Depends on how many complaints and how well documented they are. DOT violations could result in license suspensions, fines, mandatory equipment inspections. Labor violations could trigger wage and hour investigations. Tax issues could mean penalties, interest charges, and ongoing compliance monitoring. I closed my eyes, seeing 3.5 years of my life from a completely different angle. I hadn't just been holding the company together. I'd been covering up fundamental management failures that should have shut us down years ago. Every problem I'd solved, every crisis I'd managed, every system I'd implemented, it had all been damage control for a business that was structurally unsound. There's something else, Ray said, lowering his voice. I found records of payments to your brother that don't match any services rendered. Monthly transfers of $1,500, categorized as consulting fees, going back 2 years. Consulting fees. Dylan, who'd never worked a day in the logistics industry, who couldn't tell a bill of lading from a delivery receipt, had been receiving consulting fees while I'd been begging for health insurance. How did you find this? Your company's financial records are public for certain types of business loans. Your father took out a small business administration loan last year to expand the fleet. The paperwork includes detailed expense reports. Ray pushed a spreadsheet across the table. Look at this. Dylan's consulting payments total $36,000 over the past 2 years. That's more than some of your full-time drivers make. I stared at the numbers, feeling something cold, and finally settled in my chest. This wasn't just favoritism or poor judgment. This was systematic fraud. using company resources to support Dylan's lifestyle while claiming the business couldn't afford to properly compensate the person keeping it operational. Ray, I need copies of everything. Every document, every report, every piece of evidence you've compiled. Marcus, be careful. This kind of information is powerful, but it's also dangerous. If you're planning to use it against your family, I'm not planning to destroy them, I interrupted. I'm planning to protect myself. When I leave, they're going to try to blame me for any problems that surface. They're going to claim I sabotaged the business or stole clients or damaged their reputation. I need proof that these problems existed long before I decided to walk away. Ray nodded slowly, understanding the strategic value of documentation. Smart. Cover your ass before you move. But Marcus, you realize that if this information ever becomes public, it could shut them down permanently? I gathered the documents and slid them into my laptop bag. That's their choice to make. I've spent 3 years keeping their secrets and covering their mistakes. After January 1st, their secrets are their own responsibility. We shook hands outside the diner, and Ray gave me a piece of advice that would prove prophetic. The best? Revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something so successful that their failure becomes irrelevant. My next stop was the public library, where I spent 4 hours researching business licensing requirements, commercial insurance policies, and DOT regulations for starting a freight company. Phoenix Freight Solutions wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a business plan with concrete steps and realistic timelines. I already had the most critical asset, relationships. Tommy Chen, Jennifer Walsh, Dave Rodriguez, and 43 other business contacts who trusted me personally. The drivers, who'd learned to rely on my leadership and problem-solving skills. The vendors who knew I paid bills on time and treated their businesses with respect. What I needed now was infrastructure. Office space, insurance, commercial licenses, accounting systems, and most importantly, trucks. The beautiful irony was that Dad's corner cutting had created a perfect opportunity. Half the fleet at Hartwell Logistics was overdue for replacement. Instead of buying new equipment, I could purchase quality used trucks from dealers who knew me through the business relationships I'd built. By evening, I had a complete business plan, a timeline for launch, and a budget that would let me start operations within 60 days. Phoenix Freight Solutions would begin with 5 trucks, 10 carefully selected drivers, and a client base built on 3 years of trust and proven performance. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. I'd been so focused on the technical aspects of starting a business that I'd almost forgotten about the emotional component. As I sat in my car outside the library reviewing my notes, my phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos. Hey Marcus, I heard through the grapevine that changes might be coming. Whatever you decide to do, count me in. You're the only boss I've ever had who actually cares about doing the job right. Similar messages had been trickling in all day. Carlos Mendez had called during lunch to say he'd heard rumors and wanted to talk. Big Jim Patterson had left a voicemail saying he'd ride with Marcus wherever the road leads. Even Sarah Martinez had sent a cryptic text. Family loyalty goes both ways. Remember that. The people who'd worked with me every day for 3 years had seen what I'd been too close to recognize. They'd watched me hold together a dysfunctional family business through competence, dedication, and genuine care for everyone involved. They'd seen me treated as expendable by people who should have valued me most, and now they were choosing sides. I drove home through the gathering darkness, my laptop bag heavy with evidence of betrayal, and my phone full of messages offering loyalty. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. The family that shared my blood was planning to squeeze more money from me while the team I'd built was ready to follow me into an uncertain future. Tomorrow was Sunday, and I had one final piece of research to complete. I needed to understand exactly how much damage my departure would cause, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I needed to be prepared for their reaction when they realized what they'd lost. Sunday morning brought an unexpected complication. I woke up to the sound of Dylan's voice echoing through the hallway, animated and excited in a way that immediately put me on edge. When Dylan got enthusiastic about anything that wasn't related to his social life, trouble usually followed. I found him in the kitchen with Dad, both of them hunched over Dylan's laptop, pointing at something on the screen with the intensity of generals planning a military campaign. Mom was making pancakes, humming contentedly like this was just another pleasant family Sunday. "Marcus!" Dad called out when he saw me. Perfect timing. Dylan's got some ideas about expanding the business. I poured myself coffee and approached, cautiously. On the laptop screen was a PowerPoint presentation titled Hartwell Logistics Digital Transformation Initiative. The slides were polished, professional-looking, and completely detached from reality. "Check this out," Dylan said, clicking to the next slide. "I've been researching logistics automation. We could implement AI-powered route optimization, real-time, cargo tracking, predictive maintenance scheduling, even drone delivery for last-mile solutions." I stared at the screen, recognizing buzzwords from every tech startup pitch deck of the past 5 years. "Dylan, do you understand what any of these systems actually cost to implement?" "That's the beauty of it," he said, grinning like he'd solved world hunger. "Most of this stuff pays for itself within 18 months. Look at these ROI projections." The numbers on his slide were fantasy. Complete, pure fantasy. The kind of projections that assumed perfect implementation, zero learning curve, no technical difficulties, and customers who would immediately pay premium prices for services they didn't understand. "Where did you get these numbers?" I asked. "Industry reports, case studies, vendor websites. It's all documented." Dylan clicked through several more slides, each one more divorced from our actual operational reality than the last. Dad was nodding along, occasionally making appreciative noises. "This is exactly the kind of forward thinking we need. Marcus, you've done a great job keeping things stable, but we need to start looking ahead." The irony was suffocating. For 3 years, I'd been proposing modest improvements that would have genuinely enhanced our efficiency and profitability. Better dispatch software that cost $3,000, fleet maintenance tracking that would prevent breakdowns and reduce insurance costs, customer relationship management tools that would help us compete with larger companies. Every suggestion had been shot down as too expensive, too complicated, or unnecessary. But now Dylan was proposing $1 million digital transformation, and Dad was treating it like the business strategy we'd been waiting for. "Dylan," I said carefully, "have you calculated the implementation timeline for these systems? The training, requirements, the operational disruption during the transition period?" "That's detail stuff," he waved dismissively. "The important thing is vision. We implement the core systems first, then build out from there. It's an iterative development." Iterative development. He'd clearly been reading tech blogs. "What's the budget for this initiative?" I asked. Dad and Dylan exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. "We're thinking around $800,000 for the initial phase," Dad said. "It's a significant investment, but Dylan's shown me the potential returns." $800,000. The same company that couldn't afford to give me health insurance was about to gamble nearly $1 million on Dylan's fantasy technology upgrade. "Where's that money coming from?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "We'll restructure some of our current expenses," Dad said vaguely. "Maybe take out another business loan. The important thing is staying competitive." I looked at Mom, who was still humming while she cooked, apparently oblivious to the financial suicide being planned at her kitchen table. Then I looked at Dylan, who was scrolling through his slides with the confidence of someone who'd never had to explain to a client why their shipment was delayed. "Have either of you talked to our current clients about these services?" I asked. "Do you know if there's actually demand for AI-powered route optimization among the businesses we serve?" Dylan looked at me like I'd asked whether water was wet. "Marcus, this isn't about current demand. This is about creating new markets, disrupting traditional logistics models. We'll generate demand through innovation. Generate demand through innovation. I wondered if he'd practice that phrase in the mirror. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Dylan presenting increasingly elaborate solutions to problems that didn't exist, while Dad nodded approvingly. They discussed partnerships with tech startups, venture capital opportunities, and the possibility of franchising their revolutionary logistics model. Not once did they mention the maintenance backlog, the insurance compliance issues, the driver, retention challenges, or any of the actual operational problems that kept me awake at night. They were planning to build a space station while the foundation was crumbling. I excused myself and walked outside, needing fresh air and perspective. The irony was almost artistic in its perfection. They were about to invest a fortune in automation, while treating their most productive human asset like a replaceable part. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh at Mountain View Distribution. "Marcus, can we talk tomorrow? I'm hearing rumors about some big changes at your company, and I want to understand how it might affect our partnership." The rumors were spreading faster than I'd expected. In the tight-knit world of regional logistics, news traveled through informal networks of drivers, dispatchers, and warehouse supervisors. Someone had started talking, and now clients were getting nervous. I spent the afternoon making discreet phone calls to key contacts, not to poach business or spread panic, but to gather intelligence. What I learned was troubling. Word was already circulating that Hartwell Logistics was planning major operational changes, and several clients were quietly exploring alternatives. Tommy Chen at Riverside Manufacturing was the most direct. "Marcus, I've heard your company's going through some kind of transformation. I don't know what that means, but I need to protect my supply chain. If you're not going to be handling our account personally anymore, I need to start looking at other options." The digital transformation initiative wasn't just financially reckless. It was actively damaging our reputation before it had even been implemented. Clients who valued stability were interpreting innovation as code for unreliable experimentation. By evening, I had a clearer picture of the disaster unfolding. Dad and Dylan were planning to revolutionize the business without understanding why it was successful in the first place. They were about to spend money we didn't have on technology. We didn't need to solve problems that existed only in Dylan's imagination. Meanwhile, the real foundation of our success, client relationships built on personal trust and consistent performance, was already starting to erode as rumors spread about impending changes. I sat in my room that night, surrounded by the evidence of their high incompetence and the documentation of my own value to the business. The folder from Ray Kowalski contained proof of financial irregularities and regulatory violations. My laptop held business plans for Phoenix Freight Solutions and messages of support from drivers and clients. But now I had something else: a timeline. Dylan's digital transformation wasn't just a bad idea, it was an accelerant that would speed up the company's collapse. Instead of having months to execute my transition plan, I now had weeks before the situation became chaotic enough to damage everyone involved. I opened a new document and began typing. Phoenix Freight Solutions, Accelerated Launch Timeline. If they wanted to rush toward disaster, I needed to make sure I was safely clear of the wreckage. The rent increase had been the spark, but Dylan's technology fantasy was the fire that would consume everything. The question was no longer whether I should leave, but how quickly I could establish my new business before their old one imploded. I worked until 3 a.m., revising timelines, adjusting budgets, and preparing for a launch that had suddenly become urgent. By December 15th, Phoenix Freight Solutions would need to be operational. By January 1st, it would need to be thriving. Because by January 2nd, when Dad and Dylan realized what their digital transformation had cost them, I planned to be completely beyond their reach, building something sustainable while they sorted through the ruins of their innovation. The dinner table felt different that Tuesday evening. Same chairs, same dishes, same family. but the air carried a tension that made every sound sharper and every silence heavier. Dad was scrolling through his phone, occasionally showing Dylan screenshots of logistics technology articles. Mom was discussing holiday party plans as if nothing had changed. Dylan was sketching wireframes for his digital transformation dashboard on the back of an envelope. I ate methodically, watching them plan a future that no longer included me. In my jacket pocket was a resignation letter, formally typed and legally reviewed. In my laptop bag were signed driver commitments, bank approval documents, and a timeline that would reshape the regional logistics industry within 60 days. "Marcus," Dad said suddenly, looking up from his phone, "I've been thinking about Dylan's presentation. We should have you start working with him on the implementation phase. You know the operational side better than anyone." The irony was suffocating. After years of dismissing my suggestions, they wanted me to implement Dylan's fantasy technology. Upgrade. After treating me like a replaceable employee, they expected me to train my replacement while paying them for the privilege. "Actually, Dad, we need to talk. All of us." I set down my fork and pulled out the resignation letter. "I'm leaving Hartwell Logistics, effective December 15th. The silence that followed was deafening. Dylan stopped sketching. Mom stopped chewing. Dad stared at me like I'd announced my intention to join the circus. "What do you mean leaving?" Mom asked, her voice climbing toward panic. "Leaving for where? Another job? Are you moving?" "I'm starting my own company, Phoenix Freight Solutions. I'll be competing directly with Hartwell Logistics for clients in the regional market." Dad's face went through several color changes before settling on a shade of red I'd never seen before. "You can't be serious. After everything we've given you, everything we've taught you, you're going to compete against your own family? Everything you've given me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Dad, let's be specific about what you've given me. You've given me 3.5 years of unpaid overtime, no health insurance, no equity, no recognition, and now a 75% rent increase. What exactly am I supposed to be grateful for?" Dylan finally found his voice. "Marcus, this is insane. You can't just steal our clients and start your own business. There are laws against that kind of thing." "I'm not stealing anything, Dylan. I'm taking relationships I built personally and knowledge I developed through my own work. Every client who chooses to work with Phoenix Freight Solutions is making that choice based on their experience with me, not with Hartwell Logistics." Dad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is betrayal, pure and simple. We trusted you. We brought you into the family business, and this is how you repay us? You brought me in?" I stood up too, pulling out the folder Ray Kowalski had compiled. "Dad, do you want to talk about trust? Let's talk about the $36,000 you've paid Dylan over the past 2 years for consulting services he never provided. Let's talk about the maintenance violations, the insurance fraud, the tax discrepancies I've been covering up for 3 years." I spread documents across the dinner table like evidence in a courtroom. "You want to talk about betrayal? Here's Dylan's consulting payments while I was begging for health insurance. Here are the DOT violations that could have shut us down. Here are the insurance claims for accidents that happened because you refused to maintain equipment properly." Mom picked up one of the documents, her face pale. "Marcus, where did you get all this?" "From public records, Mom. From the files I've been managing for 3 years. From the systems I built to keep this company operational despite your best efforts to run it into the ground." Dylan was scanning the papers, his cocky confidence evaporating as he recognized his own signature on expense reports. "This isn't what it looks like. Those consulting fees were for legitimate work." "What work, Dylan? Name one deliverable. Name one project. Name one thing you've contributed to this business other than expensive ideas and entitled attitude." Dad grabbed the documents, shuffling through them frantically. "Where did you get this? This is private company information. You had no right." "I had every right. I'm the one who's been filing these reports, managing these accounts, covering up these problems. Every signature on every document represents work I did to keep this company alive. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of papers rustling as Dad tried to process what he was seeing. When he looked up, his anger had transformed into something more dangerous. Desperation. "Fine," he said quietly. "You want to leave? Leave. But you're not taking anything with you. No client lists, no vendor contacts, no operational procedures. Nothing." I smiled, feeling the strange calm that comes with absolute certainty. "Dad, I don't need to take anything. Every relationship I've built over the past 3 years exists in my head, in my phone, in the trust I've earned through consistent performance. Tommy Chen at Riverside Manufacturing doesn't work with Hartwell Logistics because he loves your company. He works with us because he trusts me personally." "We'll see about that," Dad said, his voice low and threatening. "We'll see how loyal your precious clients are when they understand what kind of person betrays his own family." "Go ahead," I said, gathering up the documents. "Call Tommy. Call Jennifer Walsh at Mountain View Distribution. Call Dave Rodriguez at Apex Retail. Tell them about my betrayal. Then ask them who they'd rather trust with their shipments, the company that's been cutting corners and hiding violations, or the person who's been solving their problems for 3 years." Dylan was staring at his laptop screen, apparently researching something. "Marcus, you can't use our client information to start a competing business. That's theft of trade secrets. We could sue you." "Sue me for what? For remembering the phone numbers of people I talk to every day? For maintaining professional relationships? Dylan, you might want to research the legal definition of trade secrets before you start making threats." Mom had been quiet through most of the confrontation, but now she spoke up, her voice shaking. "Marcus, please. Can't we work this out? Can't we find a way to keep the family together?" For a moment, looking at her confused and frightened expression, I almost wavered. But then I remembered the Lexus in the driveway, the consulting fees, the rent increase, and 3 years of being treated like hired help instead of family. "Mom, I tried to keep us together. I sacrificed my education, my career prospects, my personal life to keep this business running. I worked 80-hour weeks so you could afford spa weekends and luxury cars. I covered up Dad's mistakes so the family reputation wouldn't suffer. I paid Dylan's accident damages so he wouldn't face consequences. But family is supposed to work, both ways." I picked up my resignation letter and placed it in the center of the table. "This is my official notice. I'll finish out my current projects and transition my responsibilities over the next 2 weeks. After that, Phoenix Freight Solutions will handle any business relationships that choose to continue working with me." Dad was reading the resignation letter, his face growing redder with each paragraph. 2 weeks? You think you can destroy 3 generations of business with 2 weeks' notice? "I'm not destroying anything, Dad. I'm walking away from something you've already destroyed. The difference is that now you'll have to clean up your own messes." I headed toward the door, then turned back for one final observation. "By the way, you might want to postpone Dylan's digital transformation project. Based on the financial records I've reviewed, you can't afford to implement those systems. And based on the client feedback I've been hearing, you can't afford to lose any more business to operational disruptions." Walking up to my room, I could hear their voices rising in urgent, panicked conversation. Dad was making phone calls, probably, to the family lawyer. Dylan was typing frantically, likely researching non-compete laws and trade secret violations. Mom was asking questions nobody wanted to answer, but their panic couldn't touch me anymore. I'd spent 3 years managing their crises, and now their crises were their own responsibility. I had a business to launch, clients to serve, and a future to build. The hardest part was over. I'd told them the truth, shown them the evidence, and given them fair warning. Now came the easy part, proving that competence, integrity, and professional respect could build something better than family loyalty inherited authority, and willful ignorance. Phoenix Freight Solutions would rise from the ashes of their dysfunction, and for the first time in years, I'd sleep soundly knowing that tomorrow's problems would be worth solving. The 2 weeks following my resignation were a masterclass in chaos management, except this time, I wasn't the one managing the chaos. I was watching it unfold from the comfortable distance of someone who'd finally stopped trying to fix what was fundamentally broken. Wednesday morning brought the first crack in their facade. Dad called an emergency staff meeting at 7 a.m., gathering all the drivers, dispatchers, and office personnel in the warehouse break room. I attended because I was still technically employed, but I sat in the back, observing rather than participating. "There are going to be some changes around here," Dad announced, his voice carrying the forced authority of someone trying to maintain control. "Marcus has decided to pursue other opportunities, so we'll be restructuring operations to accommodate his departure." The room fell silent. These people had worked with me daily for 3 years. They knew exactly what pursuing other opportunities meant, and they knew what my departure would mean for the company. Carlos Mendez raised his hand. "Will Marcus be training his replacement? Because honestly, Mr. Hartwell, he's the one who knows how everything works around here." Dad's jaw tightened. "We'll be bringing in professional management consultants to streamline our operations. Dylan will be taking over day-to-day coordination while we implement our digital transformation initiative." I watched faces around the room as that information sank in. These were experienced professionals who'd learned to trust my judgment and rely on my problem-solving skills. The idea of Dylan managing their routes and schedules was roughly equivalent to asking a teenager to perform brain surgery. Maria Santos spoke up, her voice carefully neutral. "What about our current client relationships? Will there be changes to how we handle account management?" "Client relationships belong to Hartwell Logistics," Dad said firmly. "All client communications will now go through our central office instead of individual drivers. We're implementing proper corporate structure." That was when I knew they still didn't understand what they'd lost. Client relationships in the logistics industry weren't corporate assets. They were personal connections built on trust, reliability, and consistent performance. You couldn't transfer them through policy memos and organizational charts. After the meeting, I was approached by Kevin Foster, one of the drivers who hadn't committed to Phoenix Freight Solutions yet. "Marcus, is it true what they're saying? That you're starting your own company?" "It's true," I said. "Operations begin January 1st. Kevin looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "Are you still hiring? Because this morning's meeting scared the hell out of me. Dylan managing dispatch? Corporate structure? Man, they're going to run this place into the ground." By Friday, I had commitments from 2 additional drivers and inquiries from 3 more. Word was spreading through the logistics community that experienced professionals were jumping ship from Hartwell Logistics, and competing companies were starting to circle like sharks. The weekend brought the first client defection. Tommy Chen called me directly on Saturday morning, bypassing the new corporate structure entirely. "Marcus, I got a call from your father yesterday. He assured me that my account would receive the same level of service despite your departure. But honestly, you're the only reason I've stayed with Hartwell Logistics this long. If you're not there, I need to explore other options." "I understand completely, Tommy. I wouldn't want to put your business at risk. If you'd like to discuss alternatives, Phoenix Freight Solutions will be operational January 1st. "Send me your service agreement," he said without hesitation. "I've worked with you for 3 years. I trust your judgment more than I trust their promises." Similar conversations happened throughout the weekend. Jennifer Walsh, Dave Rodriguez, Rebecca Park from Coastal Manufacturing, client after client expressing concern about the changes at Hartwell Logistics and interest in working with Phoenix Freight Solutions. By Sunday evening, I had written commitments, representing 68% of Hartwell's current revenue base, not stolen through corporate espionage or underhanded tactics, but earned through 3 years of professional excellence and personal relationship building. Monday brought the lawyers. Dad had retained Kessler and Associates, the same firm that handled their business incorporation and contract disputes. Richard Kessler himself called me at 8 a.m., his tone professional but pointed. "Mr. Hartwell, I represent your family's business interests. I need to discuss some concerns about your new venture and potential violations of fiduciary duty, trade secret misappropriation, and tortious interference with business relationships." I'd been expecting this call and had prepared accordingly. "Mr. Kessler, I've retained legal counsel of my own. Patricia Valdez at Morrison & Partners. She specializes in employment law and business competition. I'd suggest you coordinate any discussions through her office." Patricia Valdez was a sharp attorney who'd represented several logistics professionals in similar situations. Her initial consultation had been enlightening. "Marcus, based on what you've told me, your family's company has no legal recourse. You're not violating any non-compete agreements because none exist. You're not stealing trade secrets because operational knowledge isn't proprietary information. And you're not interfering with business relationships. You're simply making yourself available to clients who choose to work with you." The legal posturing continued for 3 days, with increasingly desperate letters from Kessler's office demanding that I cease and desist from soliciting clients, using confidential information, and interfering with contractual relationships. Patricia responded to each letter with documented evidence that no violations had occurred, and polite suggestions that their time might be better spent addressing their clients' actual business problems. Wednesday brought the first operational crisis. Big Jim Patterson called me at 6 a.m., his voice tense with frustration. "Marcus, I'm sitting at the Riverside manufacturing dock with a trailer full of auto parts that was supposed to be delivered to 3 different locations yesterday. Dylan sent me the wrong routing information. The paperwork doesn't match the cargo manifest, and now the customer is threatening to cancel their contract. Jim, you need to call the main office and get Dylan to fix the routing." I tried that. Dylan's not answering his phone, and your dad says it's my responsibility to figure out delivery logistics on the road. Marcus, I've been driving for 22 years, but I'm not a dispatcher. I don't know how to untangle this mess. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of other people's crises. But this time, the crisis wasn't mine to solve. "Jim, document everything. Take photos of the cargo, save copies of the routing instructions, record any conversations with management. When this goes sideways, and it will go sideways, you'll need proof that you followed their directions." "What about the customer? They're talking about switching carriers." "That's Hartwell Logistics' problem to solve, not yours. You're a driver, not a miracle worker." By Thursday, the crisis had escalated. Riverside Manufacturing had indeed canceled their contract, citing delivery failures and communication breakdowns. 2 other clients had filed formal complaints about service disruptions. The digital transformation initiative was temporarily suspended while Dylan tried to learn basic dispatch operations. Friday brought an unexpected visitor to my apartment. Mom stood on my doorstep at 7 p.m., looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "Marcus, please. Can we talk?" I let her in, made coffee, and waited for her to explain why she was there. "Your father is falling apart," she said quietly. 3 clients canceled this week. Half the drivers are talking about quitting. Dylan is completely overwhelmed. The business is collapsing and I don't know what to do. I felt a familiar tug of sympathy, the same emotional pull that had kept me trapped for 3 years. But sympathy wasn't the same as responsibility. "Mom, what do you want me to do about it?" "Come back, please. We'll give you equity, better compensation, whatever you want. Just help us save the company." "And Dylan's digital transformation project?" She looked uncomfortable. "We can discuss modifications to the timeline." "And will my rent increase?" "We can negotiate that too." "And Dylan's consulting fees?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Mom, You're asking me to come back and solve the same problems that made me leave in the first place. The only difference is that now you're desperate enough to offer concessions. You should have offered 3 years ago. Marcus, please. This is your family. This is your heritage. My heritage is 3 generations of taking family for granted and treating competence as obligation instead of achievement. I'm building something better. She left 20 minutes later, tears in her eyes and defeat in her posture. I felt sad. For her, but not guilty. Guilt requires responsibility, and I was no longer responsible for their choices. The final week of December brought vindication in the most professional way possible. Phoenix Freight Solutions officially launched January 1st with 5 trucks, 8 drivers, 12 major clients, and a reputation for operational excellence that had been 3 years in the building. Our first day of operations was flawless. Every delivery arrived on time. Every client received confirmation calls. Every driver had accurate routing information and proper documentation. The systems I'd spent 3 years developing but never been allowed to implement at Hartwell Logistics were finally being used as intended. By January 15th, we'd added 3 more trucks and were fielding calls from clients we'd never approached. Word was spreading through the logistics community that Phoenix Freight Solutions delivered the kind of professional service that had become rare in the regional market. The contrast with Hartwell Logistics couldn't have been starker. They'd lost 70% of their client base, 5 of their best drivers, and their reputation for reliability. The digital transformation project had been abandoned after Dylan accidentally deleted 2 weeks of dispatch records while trying to implement new software. In March, I received a call from Linda Torres at First National Bank. Marcus, I wanted to let you know that Hartwell Logistics has defaulted on their equipment loan. They're facing repossession of most of their fleet. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I genuinely was. Not sorry enough to help, but sorry that it had come to such predictable destruction. There's something else, Linda continued. They've approached us about a bridge loan to cover operational expenses until they can restructure. They've listed you as a potential co-signer. I laughed. But there was no bitterness in it anymore. Linda, please note in their file that I declined to co-sign any obligations for Hartwell Logistics. My relationship with that company ended January 1st. By summer, Phoenix Freight Solutions had grown to 15 trucks and was being courted by larger logistics companies interested in acquisition or partnership. We'd maintained our reputation for excellence while building the kind of sustainable growth that comes from treating employees as partners and clients as valued relationships. The final chapter came in September when I received a certified letter from Kessler & Associates. Hartwell Logistics was filing for bankruptcy protection and liquidating assets. As part of the process, they were selling their client list, equipment, and operational procedures to recover debts. I showed the letter to Patricia Valdez, who smiled with professional satisfaction. Marcus, they're trying to sell assets they no longer possess. Their client list is worthless because the clients already left. Their equipment is mostly repossessed, and their operational procedures were apparently stored in your head rather than their filing cabinets. 3 weeks later, I received another unexpected visitor. Dylan stood on my doorstep, looking nothing like the confident graduate student who'd once pitched digital transformation initiatives. He was thinner, tired, and carrying the weight of failure in his posture. Marcus, I need to apologize. And I need to ask for help. I invited him in, more out of curiosity than sympathy. I destroyed everything, he said without preamble. The business, Dad's health, Mom's security, my own future. I thought I was smarter than everyone else, but I didn't understand anything about actually running a company. Dylan, what do you want me to do about it? I'm not asking you to save the business. It's too late for that. But I'm asking if you'd be willing to teach me what you know. Not as family, but as someone who wants to learn how to do this right. I studied his face, looking for signs of the entitled attitude that had made him impossible to work with. What I saw instead was genuine humility and the kind of exhaustion that comes from learning hard lessons. "I'll make you the same offer I make any applicant," I said finally. "You can start as a driver trainee, learn the industry from the ground up, prove that you're willing to work for what you want instead of expecting it to be given to you. If you demonstrate competence and commitment, there might be opportunities for advancement." He nodded eagerly. "Whatever it takes. I just want to learn how to build something instead of destroying it." Dylan started work the following Monday, driving local routes and learning logistics from drivers who'd forgotten more about transportation than he'd ever known. It would take him years to earn the kind of trust and respect that had come naturally to me, but he was finally willing to put in the work. By December, exactly 1 year after the Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything, Phoenix Freight Solutions was being featured in trade publications as an example of how regional logistics companies could compete with national carriers through superior service and employee retention. I was invited to speak at the National Transportation Conference about building sustainable business relationships in a competitive market. The speech was well received, but the most satisfying moment came during the Q&A session when someone asked about my background. "I learned everything I know about logistics from a family business that didn't appreciate what they had until they lost it," I said. "Sometimes the best education comes from watching what doesn't work and building something that does." The irony was perfect. They'd told me to grow up, and I had. I'd grown beyond their ability to contain, control, or comprehend. I'd grown into someone who understood that loyalty was earned through respect, not demanded through obligation. I'd grown into a leader who built success by elevating others instead of diminishing them. That Christmas, I spent the holiday with my team, the drivers, dispatchers, and office staff who'd helped build Phoenix Freight Solutions into something worth celebrating. We gathered at a restaurant overlooking the city, toasting another successful year and planning for continued growth. Maria Santos raised her glass and offered a toast that perfectly captured what we'd accomplished. To Marcus, who showed us that family isn't about blood, it's about people who show up for each other. As I looked around the table at faces that had become genuinely important to me, I realized that the rent increase had been the best thing that ever happened to me. It had forced me to stop accepting less than I deserved and start building something worthy of my capabilities. They'd wanted me to grow up, and I had. I'd grown away from people who valued me only for what I could provide, and toward people who valued me for who I was. I'd grown beyond the limitations they'd tried to impose and into possibilities they'd never imagined. And the most beautiful part was that I'd done it all without destroying anyone. I'd simply stopped saving people who didn't want to be saved, and started building something with people who shared my vision of what professional excellence could accomplish. The house where I'd once paid rent to live in my childhood bedroom was now owned by the bank. The business that had been in the family for 3 generations was a case study in bankruptcy court, but the relationships I'd built, the reputation I'd earned, and the company I'd created were thriving. Sometimes growing up means leaving home. Sometimes it means leaving the family. But it always means choosing your own future over other people's expectations. And that choice, difficult as it was, had led me to exactly where I belonged. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.